All right, everybody, welcome back. We're going to talk today, kind of finish up our unit on the 1970s, talking about the film industry during the 1970s. The 70s are a really interesting period for film, as you're going to start to see probably a lot of movies, more movies anyway, that you've probably seen before, or movie franchises that you're probably familiar with. So we'll get into that and talk kind of a little bit how the movie industry changes during this decade. All right, so to start off, the movie industry is actually kind of in a rough place as the 70s begins. There's lots of financial problems, and the old studio system that had controlled Hollywood for such a long time is kind of failing now. Most of those old studios like Paramount and 20th Century Fox no longer have control over actors and Warner Brothers, all of them. They don't have control over their actors anymore and actresses. Uh, and the old directors that had always been making films for these folks for such a long time are kind of retiring or dying off or whatever. So once the 1970s hits, we get um, kind of the emergence of a bunch of new film directors that emerged for the first time. And these are a lot of names you're probably familiar with. People like George Lucas, who made Star Wars, Steven Spielberg, who's done tons of films, E.T., Indiana Jones, Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, all kinds of movies. James Cameron, the guy that made Avatar, Titanic, uh, Martin Scorsese, who's done all the mob films like Goodfellas, The Departed, The Irishman, all that stuff. All these guys emerged for the first time in the 1970s and represent kind of this new group of film directors with new and different ideas, and they actually call them the movie brats during this time as this new group of filmmakers with different ideas that we hadn't really seen before. So what we ultimately see in movies during the 1970s are the films started to take a more familiar form. What this means is you start to see a lot more lavish and bigger set pieces. Okay, if you don't know what a set piece is, it's basically the setting for a film, or um, a big space where they construct a major set for some sort of climactic part of a movie. Wherever maybe the big action scene at the end is, or something that's going to be blown up, or something of that nature. So you start to see major set pieces. And just like in music during that time, the spectacle of the film grows much bigger as people sink more money into making these films that people want to go see for the experience, in some cases, maybe more so than for the story of the movie itself. Uh, we also see movie titles and series that debuted for the first time in the 1970s that are still around today. We see James Bond movies. Of course, they've been around since the 1960s, but they're still making them in the 70s. Uh, Rocky, the first Rocky, comes out in 1976. The first Superman movie comes out in the 70s. Obviously, Star Wars is another one. The Alien franchise, the Halloween franchise, the Jaws movies, and that sort of thing. So you see a lot of new and different movie franchises that are going to become very, very popular as time goes on. And some of them, like Rocky, James Bond, Star Wars, are still making movies of that franchise today. We see violence ratcheted up in the film industry during the 1970s. As movie regulations and restrictions are lifted a little bit, uh, it gives filmmakers the freedom to kind of make movies that feature more violence and more realism in the sense of people getting killed and blood and stuff like that. Um, Also, drug use and uh, sexual type relationships are more common in film, and language becomes much harsher. Uh, I think it's the either the very late 1960s or the early 1970s where we start hearing, like the F word in movies for the first time. So that's a big advancement or step in terms, not necessarily a good one, certainly, but it just shows you where movies are going and what's acceptable in the time and what's not. And that's a good reflection on the 1970's, where we're cynical and upset about lots of aspects of life because of, again, Vietnam, Watergate, all that other stuff, the economy, and it's reflected in film by the continuing loosening of restrictions and rules. I mentioned this before with television. We also see the advent of what are called blaxploitation films. These are films essentially, or TV shows that feature predominantly African American characters or major or a predominantly African American cast, and they play characters that are African American, but in kind of heroic type roles sometimes, or as main characters. Where in the past, African American characters are always secondary, or what we call ancillary characters to the story of the film. Examples of this would be like the Shaft film series that came out. They made a few of them in the 1970's, and he was kind of like a black version of James Bond. He was a cop in New York, but he kind of had that suaveness or whatever that James Bond has, and he would always get the girl and all that stuff, and he was a tough guy. So a lot of movies like that, characters like that. You'd see African American characters play bad guys too, wealthy, powerful bad guys. For instance, in the 1973 James Bond movie Live and Let Die, was the first one to feature a main bad guy that was African American, and a character named Mr. Kananga. Um, Other movies, you would take other popular old style movies and fill them with African American casts. One of the most notorious examples of this was a 1972 movie called Blackula. Blackula um, was a remake of Dracula, but was with an all African American cast. So you'd see people again exploiting the civil rights movement in a sense where we're more comfortable and feel more comfortable with African American characters and storylines, and Hollywood, as they always do, fully takes advantage of that. We see the full introduction of the modern movie rating system be introduced in 1970. Uh, this is with PG, well, G for like little kids, like Disney movies and stuff. Then you have PG movies, which are basically for like movies that you could would be okay to go to with your parents, but you can bring the kids. You have R-rated movies that would be restricted to people under the age of 17. And then you'd have M, which would be a rating for like mature audiences only. And then there was X-rated films too that were even more restricted than that. What the rating system allowed people to do was make films that would have cruder language, um, more bad words, uh, drugs or sexual oriented things, or more violence. And parents and people would know, or even people at the box office would know how to be able to kind of limit and prevent people that were too young or maybe too impressionable from seeing certain types of films. Okay. Let's talk about some of the popular film genres then from the 1970's. Or for one, you have science fiction films that come about during this time period. Okay, this is all a result of kind of the space race still going on. Well, it was over by the time we beat the Soviets to the moon, but because of the popularity of space and everybody's enthusiastic about space and everything during the 1970's, we start to see a lot of movies that feature, space style stories. Star Wars obviously is the most notable. That comes out in 1977. 1978, you get Close Encounters of a Third Kind, which is about an alien encounter, people making alien encounters on Earth, and the movie Alien, which spawned a bunch of sequels that comes out also in 1979, uh, which was certainly a kind of like a horror science fiction slash horror slash science fiction film of the time. Again, talking about movie series kind of staying up at the times. Another perfect example. This is the James Bond series. all the James Bond movies that come out in the 1970s kind of exploit the popular trends of the day. In the early 1970s, they used black characters in Live and Let Die. In the 1979 Bond film Moonraker, James Bond actually goes into space. It's a pretty ridiculous story, but that's what was popular at the time. And in fact, um, adjusted for inflation, it's one of the most commercially successful of any movie in the James Bond series. Another strange but interesting reality of the 1970s was the popularity of disaster films. Now, disaster films were stories about films when some kind of horrible man-made or not man-made disaster type scenario happens, in which people's lives are jeopardized, etc. Uh, Again, this is a reaction to the cynicism and realities of the time that people are living in during during the 1970s, um, where people felt that any horrible situation could happen, and were happening with the failures of Vietnam, with the political problems, with all this other stuff. So there were disaster films about everything you could possibly imagine during the 1970s. Probably the most famous was Jaws, of course, about a giant man-eating shark that was terrorizing people at beaches. That came out in 1975. More on Jaws in a little bit. And for pretty much the summer of 1975, people were afraid to go to the beach because they were afraid they were going to get eaten by a giant shark. So that shows you kind of the cultural impact of a movie like that. Poseidon Adventure is kind of like a Titanic type story of a big cruise ship that uh, gets a hole and sinks. The Towering Inferno is about a this like mega um, skyscraper that was built, and it catches on fire and people are stuck in it and they need to get out and all that sort of thing. There's a movie called Earthquake that's about a major earthquake, a movie called Airport that's about hostage situations. Anything you could possibly imagine as a disaster film concept came out during the 1970s. And these films are really interesting in that they usually had star-studded casts, um, big ensemble casts, as they would call them, with big name actors of the day. Uh, you had to appear in a disaster film. In a sense, it was almost like a Marvel movie of its time. That pretty much every actor you could think of um, plays some kind of role within that universe of films. Uh, from the most celebrated, accomplished actors to people that maybe aren't too appreciated for their acting ability, but maybe are good looking or something of that nature. Another thing that's also kind of similar to disaster films and resultant from the cynicism of the period is the emergence of slasher or horror films during the 1970s. Movie series like Halloween, which we talked about with serial killers and everything, or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, kind of touch on this concept of um, shallow uh, serial killers with no real regard for anyone or anything, and they're these menacing figures. Um, you know, The Exorcist, of course, kind of delves into cult behavior and stuff as this girl is kind of taken over by, Satan and has to, they have to get Satan out of her being and everything, and it's just another terrifying movie. These films are all extremely popular, all rated R films, so not everybody can see them, but they're extremely popular during their time, and is again a real reflection on some of the practices or beliefs in society during this time where there's just a scary killer out there. I think Halloween is a great example of that. Michael Myers is this masked killer who wears this white mask that you can't only for a second see what's behind it in the film, and he seems to have no specific motivation other than just wanting to kill people. Wearing that mask is kind of in a sense telling us that it could be anybody behind that mask, and that killer could be anybody from the most normal person down the street to somebody that you've never seen before. Another thing that's interesting about 70s films is we start to see the popularity, and again, it's another example of cynicism, are these rogue cop films. A road cop is basically is a movie about a cop, or usually, usually a movie about a cop that kind of goes outside of the law to a certain degree to achieve his end. Usually goes outside the law because he's frustrated with the rules that are preventing him from getting the killer, the bad guy, whoever it is that he's trying to stop. Uh, the most well-regarded film in this series was a 1973 or 74 movie called Serpico. But probably the most remembered are the Dirty Harry films starring Clint Eastwood, or the Death Wish franchise films starring Charles Bronson. Dirty Harry is a super serious cop guy named Harry Callahan that is willing to do whatever he needs to stop a serial killer in the first film, or whatever the crime might be in any subsequent film. The movie spawned four sequels during the 1970s and 80s, and are really gritty and realistic, and have levels of kind of seriousness and violence or action that we hadn't quite seen in movies before. The Death Wish franchise is about a guy named Paul Kersey who sees his um, wife murdered by a drug dealer. He was an architect, and he sees his wife murdered by a drug dealer, and decides, because the law is not going to do anything about it, he takes matters into his own hands and goes out and starts killing all these drug dealers, kind of as a vigilante crime fighter, in a sense. This spawns sequels, and again, uh, they're not afraid to kill characters that are important to a movie story, to show you how rough um, this person's life is and their motivations. For instance, when you're talking about the Death Wish franchise, it shows his wife get killed in the first film. In the second film, in the sequel, his daughter is killed. In the third film, like, his best friend from when he was in the military is killed. And then they made a fourth one. They made a couple others. I've only seen a few. They made a fourth one. He had this new girlfriend, and at the end of that movie, she gets gunned down by some drug kingpin or something. So they're very um, realistic in the sense that you don't see the film's hero per se, get out unscathed in one way or another, and they dispatch the bad guy at the end, but it's at a major cost for the hero, right? And that's something that we don't always like to see in films. We don't always want to see the good guy win in the end, but also suffer some heartbreaking loss. Another thing that happens as a result of kind of movie restrictions being loosened is we see a lot of um, comedic films of the period become much more cruder. Monty Python movies like The Holy Grail and The Meaning of Life come out during the 1970s. They're British made, but the humor in there is a lot cruder, and the language is more questionable, and things of that nature. That is certainly a departure from the slapstick type comedy that we'd seen in previous decades. Mel Brooks movies like Blazing Saddles and many others during the 1970s um, play off things like civil rights and racism issues to make kind of a joke about it. Blazing Saddles is about a city who gets a new sheriff, and he's black, and nobody wants his black sheriff, and there's all these jokes that happen as a result of that. So we see comedy take some steps to become cruder and less user friendly or viewer friendly, I guess, during the 1970s. All right, so again, here's some movie posters from the 70s. Close Encounters, we talked about that. Star Wars, the Shaft movie, Dolomite is an example of another blaxploitation film. Shaft there. A couple James Bond movies from the 70s. This one actually deals with The Man with the Golden Gun, deals with the energy crisis of the 70s, while Moonraker takes James Bond to space, which is kind of crazy. Superman, of course, we still, make those. Rocky, arguably, maybe next to Star Wars, the most famous movie of the 1970s. Willy Wonka, that's a popular cult film. I told you I was going to tell you a little bit more about Jaws. Jaws is generally regarded as the first blockbuster film. Okay, a blockbuster film is essentially a movie that people spend a lot of money on, and it makes a boatload of money at the box office. Jaws was like one of the most financially successful movies of the 1970s. I believe it was the highest grossing movie ever for a couple of years until Star Wars came out. So we see that influence there. So Star Wars, Rocky, Jaws, these are all big blockbuster films from the 1970s that launched this concept of the blockbuster movie. What's a blockbuster movie today? Movies that are made bigger and you expect them to make a lot of movies. Like if it's a Marvel movie or if it's some big event movie at the end of the year or a modern James Bond movie or any number of things. These are what we see as major blockbusters. All right, folks, I've gone on long enough. That's the end of your notes for the 1970s. We will discuss this a little bit tomorrow in our Zoom class. Hope everybody's well, and we'll talk to you later.